Hello, everyone, and welcome to Slash Film Daily for Tuesday, November 12th, 2019. On today's episode, we're going to talk about Disney Plus's The Mandalorian. We have seen the first episode entitled Chapter 1, and we're going to have a spoiler-filled discussion about that. Joining me on today's podcast is Slash Film Weekend Editor, Brad Oman.
Hey, that's me.
And special guest, Bryan Young, who is from Star Wars Insider, StarWars.com, and the Full of Sith podcast. He reviewed this episode for us on SlashFilm.com. Thanks for joining us, Bryan.
It is indeed my pleasure.
I feel like you are the best expert in Star Wars mythology that I know, so I'm glad to have you here with us. And it is my birthday, so I'm glad Bob Iger decided to release Disney Plus and The Mandalorian on my birthday. Thanks, Bob.
Happy birthday!
Yes. So there's that. Okay, let's get into it. Let's talk about our brief reactions to this. I'll start things off, and I think Bryan and I both saw like a package of footage a few weeks back, and I had a reaction back then, so my reaction's kind of similar. This is pretty incredible. It feels more like a spaghetti western, a space spaghetti western than, I guess, Star Wars, even though Star Wars could be described as that. I even think I saw someone online like say it felt more tonally like Firefly than Star Wars, but I don't think that's a bad thing. Filoni can be felt all over this, from the humor to the action to the, how he chooses to drop in Star Wars mythology. And I love the little tease at the end, and I'm very intrigued to where this series is going to take us. Brad, what was your thoughts?
I thought this was fantastic. It's pretty much exactly what I wanted from a show like this. I think that it really digs into the seedier side of the Star Wars universe, especially in a time after things are very uncertain, after the fall of the Empire. I like that it has a different genre feel than we're used to in Star Wars, as opposed to just feeling like general Star Wars in spirit. I think this is where the future of Star Wars lies. This has the visual look and the aesthetic of the original Star Wars trilogy, but it has a genre that is distinctly Western within the galaxy of Star Wars characters. And I like seeing Jon Favreau and the various directors that are doing these episodes play in the Star Wars universe, but do something that doesn't exactly feel like Star Wars, but has elements that we've all come to love and recognize from the universe.
Yeah. By the way, that soundtrack, it's like so much different than any other Star Wars soundtrack. I'm loving it. Bryan, what did you think of the first episode?
So I was really nervous. I think I expressed this to you when we watched some of this footage, which was actually a lot of this episode that we saw, that I was really concerned that we were going to get too gritty and too dark and too over the top with what I would call like the sensibility of a 13-year-old's idea of how cool Star Wars is. But I was really gratified as we watched the episode to see that it didn't take itself too seriously. That was all matched equally with a knowledge of the lore and a respect for it, but also with humor that was there were laugh out loud funny moments. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen a more suicidal droid, and that was such good stuff. And the ending hook had me right. I was already picking up tones of Lone Wolf and Cub, and this just it made me twice as interested in seeing the next episode where they left us off here.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like I am noticing the people. There are some people that they like this, but they don't love this. And the criticisms I'm generally seeing around is that the main character is like, because he's underneath a mask, that it's hard to relate with him. It's we're not seeing a person's face. We're not getting, he's a man of mystery. We do get a little bit of his origin. We'll talk about that later. But I feel like that is the one criticism that I'm seeing a lot on Twitter from people. Actually, even Kitra, I watched with my girlfriend Kitra, and she had some problems relating with this character. Why should I care about this character? So there's that. It should be acknowledged. Okay, let's dive in, because there's a lot of questions around this episode. let's start with okay, so the beginning of this episode involves Mandalorian tracking a bounty. He goes to some icy planet and he gets this guy in a bar. There's this badass fight where one of the guy gets ripped in two by the door, and there's that totally badass line, I can bring you in warm, or I can bring you in cold. So there's this creature that hails the taxis with this musical instrument. What is that, Brian?
That's a Kubaz. We first saw those in A New Hope. Garandan was the Imperial spy that alerted the Empire to the Millennium Falcon's docking bay in Mos Eisley, and that was the first time we saw one of those creatures in Star Wars. And I think we might have seen some in the background, but nothing major in some of the cartoons. But this is the first time they've come back into the world of Star Wars.
Is it like this episode has some weird comedy to it, I feel like. And these, now that they are like basically the guy that handles the taxi outside of the Bellagio is like the role of right? It's
interesting that you've got you've got that, but also the fact that the guy he's hauling in is Horatio Sands, and the guy who's the taxi driver is Brian Posehn.
Yeah, I loved seeing like little bit parts played by comedians like that. It was so fun to me.
Yeah, no, it really was. But then you've got the added element where it's like, this is silly, but then as the story unfolds, you realize what the Mandalorian's problem with droids is. That he was a survivor of the Clone Wars and that his parents were sort of taken away by the Separatist army. If you look in those shots of his parents, you can see super battle droids there sort of terrorizing them and taking them from him in that way. And so when he says no droids, it plays like a funny moment, but then it gets that added dramatic relevance when you learn later more about him. So I really think that that's just great filmmaking, having that stuff work on multiple levels, even when it seems like it's just a joke on the surface.
Yeah, I actually was going to ask you about the droid. You know, why did he not trust droids? Because the first car speeder that's called, is piloted by a droid, and he didn't want to get into it. I did not pick up on that later on, so I'm curious to hear what else you picked up on in that scene, but we'll get to that.
I think that there's more that will be revealed with that flashback too, because there were better shots of what that flashback in the trailers where it was clear that there were super battle droids, and it moved much too fast, I think, in this episode to really pick up on that unless you were looking for it.
Yeah, no, it was definitely a frame by frame kind of situation to pick them up. But I really loved just it's really great screenwriting, I think, on Favreau's part, and great directing on Filoni's part, that you start it with a scene of him saying he doesn't like droids and doesn't want to deal with them. You show the flashback that, if you're paying careful attention to, you see that he's a survivor of an attack by the Separatist droid army, and then you have him forced to deal with IG-11, and by the time you hit that moment where IG-11's going to make his final move, it's almost like a turn again that's both surprising and inevitable about what he did with the droid. So that thread of his attitude about droids fits in with throughout the entire piece, and it's barely noticeable that first run through, and it's really clever writing.
Let's talk about this first bounty that he's bringing in, the blue guy. I don't know his name offhand.
I don't think he has a name. His species he referred to as a mithril.
Mithril?
Or a mithril.
It seemed like this was establishing like a setup that he was going to be a bigger character in the series, but quickly we find out that he gets, frozen in carbonite and is dumped off for, the bounty. I felt like there was going to be more to this relationship. Brad, am I alone here?
I was wondering what kind of role he was going to play and why he was picking this person up, but yeah, as it goes on, really, it just seems just to set up basically the everyday life of someone like the Mandalorian and how he goes about getting his targets and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and we get to see the vac tube, I think it's called. Is that right?
Well, yeah, that's what he called it there, but it's been referred to as a refresher elsewhere in Star Wars.
Yeah, so we first saw that in Rebels or Clone Wars, something like that.
It was Rebels, Wedge Antilles, in an episode where Chopper goes, where Chopper is hacked by Josh Gad, and and
not a character played by Josh Gad, but Josh Gad. No, just kidding.
Yeah, no, Josh Gad. Well, his character's name is the Controller.
Yeah.
So he doesn't really have a name, but Josh Gad takes control of Chopper, and Wedge needs to use the restroom, and the droid, the Marvin the sad robot sort of droid, comes in and interrupts Wedge at the refresher. That was way more detail about a bathroom in Star Wars than you needed, so sorry about that.
Okay, so he goes to meet Carl Weathers' character, Grief
Karga.
Yeah, and actually in this cantina or restaurant, whatever it is, we see someone that looks like it could be Constable Zuvio in the corner. Is that Constable Zuvio?
I would doubt it's Constable Zuvio, but it did look like a Q-Zo, which is the species, and they had a similar helmet. Interesting thing about that species, Q-Zos were named after the Master Swordsman character in Seven Samurai.
Oh, I did not know that.
That's what you got me here for.
Yeah. Okay. So Carl Weathers offers him Imperial credits. Imperial credits are not worth what they used to be. He gets calamari money instead, and Weathers basically offers him this job that is off books, that doesn't have a puck, and it's high paying bounty. We see the Mandalorian go through the marketplace. We see some Jawas and some Star Wars stuff, and Mandalorian knocks on this door, and there's this iDroid thing that comes out that that's like the same thing that was in Jabba's palace, I think, right?
Yeah, he has the same dialogue, and I wouldn't even be surprised if it was the same recordings either.
Yeah, so he goes in there, and instantly we see that there's some stormtroopers. So they're guarding.
Don't forget the Gonk droid, though. There's a Gonk droid.
Gonk droid. Yes, I love the Gonk droid.
Although the Gonk droid does look like it's been upgraded a bit, because it seemed like it had like a transparent shell on its head instead of the usual just box droid style.
Good call. Yeah, I did notice that. But the next thing we see is a bunch of stormtroopers guarding Werner Herzog's character. My question to you, Brad, are these stormtroopers that have been, the remnants of the Empire collapsing, or are these like guards that have just salvaged, stormtrooper gear?
That's a good question. I would be willing to bet that they are probably real stormtroopers who, in the fall of the Empire, are just trying to find whatever jobs they can, doing, protection for people, becoming bodyguards, or anything. But it could stand to reason that they're also just people who have salvaged stormtrooper armor. I hadn't thought of that. I just initially thought that they were just stormtroopers misplaced, doing anything they can to survive.
I mean, the armor is pretty worn and beat up. Could this mean that Werner Herzog has ties to the Empire?
I'd be willing to bet that more so he's just hired these people as hired guns as his bodyguards. He seems like the kind of person who maybe does that, but he does have that medallion that has the Galactic Empire, the Imperial symbol on it. So, and he does appear to be at least working with somebody who may have ties to the Empire.
Yeah, at that second, a guy named Dr. Pershing comes out, and there's a little bit of a scuffle. What do you make of this, Brian?
Dr. Pershing has a uniform that's vaguely similar in style to Imperial science officers that we saw in Rogue One, and with Mads Mikkelsen's character. And I do think these are all people who, if they're not, there is no Empire, but they're people who were there with the Empire. Herzog's mysterious, nameless character hands him a brick of Beskar steel stamped with an Imperial logo in it that was from what they refer to as the Great Purge.
And by the way, that seems like so remnant of the Nazis stamping their logos in gold bars. It's such a cool touch.
And it brings a lot of, that in particular brings a lot of really high emotion if you remember all the stuff with the Mandalorians in Rebels and how they were treated and subjugated and almost, killed in a genocide by the Empire. The Mandalorians have had it really rough over the last 25 years in galactic history.
let's talk about Beskar Steel for a second. Like, why is Beskar Steel so important?
Well, it can deflect blaster bolts, and Beskar Steel as armor, according to Sabine Wren in Rebels, every bit of it was designed to combat Jedi, right? Like every bit of a Mandalorian's armor was something that they came up with culturally when they were doing their expansive conquests of the galaxy to combat the Jedi specifically, and they were the only people who weren't Force users that would stand toe to toe with the Jedi. So that it's something that both has a cultural significance because they passed that armor down from generation to generation. Sabine's Beskar Steel armor, she was able to melt it down and reshape it, but she talks about how it's 500 years old and has the scars and ghosts of battle from it, from all of those people who owned it before her in it. And so it's culturally significant, and it's significant in the sense of the galaxy where it can stop a blaster bolt with no problem, and a lightsaber with, for at least a minute.
At least a minute. I'm just here to point out the badass lines. The stormtroopers say that we have you 4-1, and Mandalorian says, "I like those odds." Just such a cool Star Wars line. Brad, what did you think of Werner Herzog in this show?
God, I love Werner Herzog in this show so much. Every single line he says sounds so intimidating, and you're just hanging on every single word. His voice is just incredible, and this is like the perfect part for him to play. I love it so much.
Yeah, and I'm sure Dr. Pershing is going to come back into play after we find out what the bounty it actually is at the end of this episode. But let's get to that. So we're in the streets again. We see Quacky Monkey Lizard being roasted while another's watching on. Mandalorian enters an underground lair for Mandalorians. What is this place? What do we think?
I think this is some sort of outpost of exiled Mandalorians. We heard about something like the Great Purge. Unfortunately, where the canon has left us as far as the Mandalorians have been concerned is the Empire had taken over, and basically sort of in a World War I, World War II sort of situation, they were taken over by a guy named Gar Saxon, who was sort of like their equivalent of Pétain when he took over and was operating the French government, the Vichy government for the Nazis. And so he was basically an imperial stooge, this Gar Saxon character, and he didn't get dealt with until just before the events of Rogue One on the show Rebels. And then at that point, they restored power, at least culturally, to Katie Sackhoff's character, Bo-Katan, but that was the last thing we saw, is that they were still struggling from overcoming the Empire, and we haven't seen anything about them in the canon so far, or since then. So this could be some exiled group that still hasn't been able to come back because of the war, or maybe something worse happened to Mandalore. We just don't know.
I like that there's other Mandalorians in the show. For some reason, a show called The Mandalorian, I thought he was going to be the only one that we'd see for a while. So it's very cool.
Same.
There's a woman Mandalorian who has like a helmet made out of, it looks like a golden metal, and has horns, and she's using the steel to create a shoulder pad for the Mandalorian.
Yeah.
Who is this? Do we know anything about her?
The only thing we know about her is that her name, she's played by an actress named Emily Swallow. The only guess I can make, aside from the fact that she's sort of a Mandalorian blacksmith, is that the only other character we've seen with horns on their helmet was Gar Saxon, and that was when he was working for Maul, when Maul was nominally in charge of Mandalore. So in the canon, that's really the only other time we've seen horns like that on a Mando helmet, and I don't know if that's going to tie back to Maul or tie back to Gar Saxon's group of Mandos, and that was something that was interesting. I haven't heard the term signet that she uses.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that, because she asked him, has your signet been revealed? Like, what do we think that means?
I think that means something like that would lead him to know who his house or his clan is, and because he's what they call a foundling, an orphan, and I think that the revelation of that is probably going to factor in the show significantly and maybe tie back to some of these other issues of the Mandos. But yeah, I think that's what that signet is meant to imply.
We also hear that the leftover Beskar steel will go to the foundlings. So I'm wondering, like, Brad, what do you make of this? Are all the Mandalorian like orphans? Like, what is this?
It doesn't sound like they all are, because Mando kind of goes out of his way, to say that, to mention the fact that he was a foundling and he likes helping any way they can. But it does seem like that maybe the Mandalorians have become kind of a place where orphans can possibly go to, make it easier to survive, or something like that. Like that, maybe they almost like an orphanage that teaches them how to take care of themselves.
Do you think over this series we're going to see the Mandalorian slowly build up his armor into all Beskar steel?
I thought that's what this implied.
Yeah.
I feel like, I mean, depending on how this job goes too, that could turn out to be a lot easier, since he's supposed to get a whole container shipment of it, right?
Yeah. I have a feeling, Brad, he's not going to get that container of Beskar steel, but we'll see.
Yeah, my guess is that's going to go south.
Yeah. Okay, so he flies to this mountainous desert planet. Some alien creatures attack. They're called blurgs. Have we seen them before, Brian?
We have. So blurgs were mounts used by Cham Syndulla and the Free Ryloth movement on Ryloth. I feel like a giant nerd right now. Because I'm like,
what part of Star Wars canon is that from?
That's from Rebels.
Okay.
So we've seen them in Rebels. I don't think this planet is Ryloth, however, but I really, really, really loved the look of how it looked like it was a cracked sort of salt bed zoomed up 1,000 times 1,000 that they were running across. It was so cool looking.
I really love this battle between him and the creatures. Like, the creatures look... This show looks so big budget. It looks so... Like, those creatures look better than anything I've seen, I think, on a television show.
Yeah, I don't know if they did part of it practical and then just used CG to kind of, like, touch it up a little bit. But there were shots when they looked like they were real practical creatures, that maybe there was somebody, like, inside something controlling them.
I want to see a behind the scenes of this. But okay, moving on. An Ugnaught played by Nick Nolte.
Yes.
Yeah. Basically comes to the save. He tranks them, and it's funny seeing Nick Nolte under all that makeup. And he basically says he's gonna help him out because he has never met a Mandalorian before, and he trains him how to ride. He needs to ride an Ugnaught to get to where he needs to go. I mean, a blurg.
No.
Yeah, he needs to ride a blurg to get where he needs to go. So he's
riding an Ugnaught is a totally different show.
That would be funny. That would be hilarious. And so he teaches him to ride the blurg, and it's kind of like there's this musical score that almost feels like a Rocky movie, but set in the Star Wars universe. I'm really digging it. And there's a quick mention here when the Mandalorian does it, like, is like, fuck this, I'm not going to ride a blurg, where he's like, your ancestors rode the great mythosaur. I think you could ride a blurg. So that is the kind of awesome drop of Star Wars canon that I love from Dave Filoni. What is a mythosaur?
So, the skull emblem that everyone associates with Boba Fett, that was in the original sort of canon, or the expanded universe canon, known as a mythosaur, and that was a mythosaur skull. During the Legends reboot, that was sort of erased, and no one quite knew what they were called, and no one sort of acknowledged that they might be mythosaurs, but they were beasts on Mandalore that the Mandalorians had tamed. And getting them back in canon, I think, made a lot of people... will make a lot of people happy.
Yeah.
Because, we haven't had a name for it. We weren't sure what to call it because there hadn't been any canon reference. And this is just a good thing.
Okay, so we're explaining there'll be no peace on this planet until these people that have occupied the space are gone. So basically, he's helping him. he's helping the Mandalorian get there because he wants to get rid of these people. And when the Mandalorian shows up, he also finds that IG-11 also shows up at the same time. This is the character.
So hold on. Before we get to that, real quick though,
yeah.
I did want to say the Ugnaught character was something that almost took me out of it a little bit, and I'm on the fence about it still.
Why?
Because I don't think that the mouth movement was very good on it. And granted, I think that that's probably intentional as a throwback to how the Ugnaughts looked in The Empire Strikes Back. It just felt kind of hokey to me sometimes when the character would talk and the mouth didn't quite work well with what the lines being said. And I also don't think that's Nick Nolte in that makeup. I think he's just doing the voice.
Yeah, he's just doing the voice. That's not him. There was a different performer.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
He's much shorter than Nick Nolte.
Yeah,
he's much shorter than everybody.
Yeah,
yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
I just thought they used CG or something to do that.
No, I mean I'm pretty sure that was practical makeup at least, because it was kind of clunky in that way, and so I don't know. I'm on the fence about it because I kind of like the idea of them keeping it a little bit looking a little bit bad, I guess you could say, because it's supposed to have that same feel of the original trilogy. But it did feel odd at times with some of the lines that he was saying.
No, I agree. Okay, IG-11 shows up at this base. He's also taking on this bounty, and IG-11 is another bounty hunter. He's a droid bounty hunter voiced by Taika Waititi, who directs a couple episodes of this upcoming season. And I will say this. We knew that he was going to be in this. We've seen footage, and we knew that Taika Waititi was going to voice him. And it was... I was expecting it to be more Taika, like as I've seen in his previous movies. He typically features into his movies, and this was a little bit less Taika than I was expecting. Brad, am I wrong?
No, I kind of felt the same way too. I was expecting it to have a little bit more personality and that kind of liveliness that Taika's characters usually have, but I think it's good that they probably went against those expectations, because that almost makes IG-11 funnier than maybe he otherwise would have been. You know, I think if he was just a wisecracking bounty hunter droid, then it would have been like, okay, oh yeah, that's funny, and that's what we wanted to expect. But in this case, he acts more like a robotic droid in the way he talks and the way he approaches the mission and speaks with more of the like old school sci-fi things, the way robots used to talk about, saying affirmative and agreeing things in a very practical protocol kind of way. And especially once he starts choosing whether or not he's going to self-destruct like 5 or 6 times throughout this battle, that's hilarious.
Yeah, no, I thought that was funny. They agree to team up and split the bounty. You know, IG keeps on deciding if he's going to self-destruct. They're battling against these people, which I didn't know who they were, but I had my subtitles on, and the subtitles told us that they are Niktos, Nikto. Who are they?
Yeah, Nikto. They are in the they were they're sort of a race that's been enslaved a lot. We've seen Jedi that were Nikto. One notable one was again a tie to Ryloth, and I'm not sure how much that actually connects, but the Jedi Master, I'm a gonna die, or I'm gonna gun D or something like that. But it was basically I'm gonna die. He served at the Battle of Ryloth in the Clone Wars, and then the Nikto were enslaved in Jabba's palace. And in the novel Bloodline, one of them, Rin Riven D, which was an underworld sort of mob boss. He was the one who let Princess Leia know that she was, or General or Senator Organa at that point, that she was revered among the Nikto people as the Hutt Slayer, because recordings of her choking Jabba had spread amongst their people.
Okay, so eventually Mando gets the Gatling gun, which has this fun sequence of him taking out the Nikto, and they shoot their way through the door. They sense a life form. It's in the small pod. They open the pod, and it is a baby, even though they were told they were after someone that was 50 years old. IG-11 speculates that species age differently. Perhaps it could live many centuries. As we know, this is a baby of like the same species that Yoda is. We don't actually know the name of that species, but we do know Yoda died. He was over 900 years old. So, they live a very long time. And it's interesting here because this is one of the first rumors I had ever heard about the Mandalorian, like a year ago. I heard this was a story about a bounty hunter who goes in search for a bounty and finds out that it's a child and decides not to return the bounty. But I did not know it was a Yoda creature. It should also be noted that Making Star Wars reported, I think a couple weeks back, that George Lucas contributed to The Mandalorian by providing some details on Yoda's species, including a name. And George Lucas has always been kind of very cagey on giving any details on Yoda's species. Even though, like, some people think there's a species in the prequels called the Linux, I think. And some people had thought that was Yoda's species. That is incorrect. So what do we know here? What do we know about Yoda's species?
The only thing we know about Yoda's species is that until this point there were two of them. There was Yoda, and Yaddle also served on the Jedi Council. And that actually is what is the most interesting thing about this. If this is still a babe in arms and a bassinet, and it's 50 years old, that could date this back to the point where this could be a Force-sensitive child who had been brought up in a Jedi nursery like we'd seen in the first and second season. No, I think the second season of the Clone Wars, and Palpatine was after the Jedi younglings. That this could be some holdover from that because Palpatine was interested in stealing those babies. If this is some Imperial plot to raise maybe another Inquisitor or something like that, that would be really interesting. And there's a lot of storytelling potential there, just given the age of the infant.
Yeah, I'm wondering if the species is inherently very highly Force sensitive, if they have a high midichlorian count. Brad,
yeah.
What are your thoughts?
This is the most intriguing, I think, part to me, because I was like very surprised about when they showed this thing, because not only does it look cute, but it's just like, oh my gosh, like what is this? What is this going to mean? Like, why do they want this thing? What do they hope to do with it? Is it the Empire that wants it? There's so many possibilities here as to where this could go, and I'm very excited to see like the direction the show heads with that kind of ending.
Yeah, it's very intriguing. We did mention on this podcast before that they refused to show this whole episode to critics because they said there was a big spoiler that they didn't want out there. We're guessing this is the spoiler, but this doesn't really... I don't think this ties in a major way yet to the larger Star Wars canon. Some people are speculating, could this could this person be like Yoda's son or daughter?
Or even a clone.
I have not seen that speculation.
But yeah, no, I think it's interesting simply because, it's weird because I don't know why they made us hide it or why they held back screeners, because it's a detail that like we wouldn't have spoiled anyway, because it's a cool reveal and it's the very end of the episode, So the fact that they're holding it back, I don't know. Obviously, it has something big to do with the rest of the series, but since we don't know what's happening, there's really nothing that would have been ruined by getting the screeners out there early.
I mean, I agree, but I think that there's some other elements too that they wanted to obscure. I think having other Mandalorians on the show is something they wanted to keep, something they did keep secret in all of the marketing. And that could have been as much one of the story points they were trying to avoid, because it seems like they were billing the Mandalorian as this lone wolf who works for himself and is capable of anything. But then when you see the episode, it seems pretty clear he's handing all of his money back to the people of his culture, which is a very different character than I think they were trying to sell in the marketing.
So where do we think this is going to go from here? So he finds this young child. He's obviously not going to bring him back and get that Beskar steel. I feel like he feels, he's not a robot underneath that armor. He's he has a heart. And
as an orphan,
as
a fellow orphan, I think he's got a lot of feelings tied up in that.
So where do you guys think this is going to take us?
Lone Wolf and Cub, man. Seriously.
I mean, all the great Star Wars movies and stories have been inspired by, stuff like that. So that, I mean, you've made almost a career about writing about that kind of stuff. So that makes complete sense.
Well, and it makes sense too. So at that press event, I got to do a roundtable with Favreau and Filoni, and the first thing I asked about was those cinematic connections. And I said, I'm picking up a lot of Kurosawa, Yojimbo, Leone with A Fistful of Dollars, and even some Lone Wolf and Cub. And how was it matching the technology to those things? And Filoni and Favreau just sort of shared a look, and then he proceeded to steamroll over the specifics of the inspiration and gave me a really general answer.
Of course.
Which now, in retrospect, was like, oh my, I'd actually hit upon something they were not prepared in any way to talk about.
Oh, yeah, I think for sure. Brad, where do you think this is going to take us?
Yeah, I mean, that's the best, guess we have really is that, because it's very clearly that vibe. The works of, Kurosawa have been influential on Star Wars since the inception of it with George Lucas. And so I think that Favreau and Filoni, they definitely tapped into that, and they wanted to push that even further and tell a different kind of story in Star Wars, even if it does feel familiar simply because of how much influence Lone Wolf and Cub has had. I think that there's probably still surprises in store, and I doubt it'll follow that kind of story in the exact same way. But that influence there is clearly something that will shape the rest of the series.
Yeah, we'll get at least an episode of that vibe.
Yeah, and by the way, I feel like Disney was in the right for not screening this episode for critics who were doing interviews, because the interviews would all be about this Yoda creature and the Mandalorian, hideout. But I don't understand why they're not giving critics a screener the day of and being like, there's an embargo for, midnight tonight or something. Like, because
I wouldn't be surprised if we'll get screeners for future episodes. I think, and they did release screeners for this for the press this morning. So,
yeah.
But that was also like 9 hours after it was available for everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing we got to talk about here is, IG-11 was a big part of the marketing campaign. Like, you can actually buy T-shirts that just have IG-11 on it. And in this final moment of this episode, this chapter 1, the Mandalorian shoots IG-11 because IG-11 was going to kill the baby, or the 50-year-old youngling. So does that mean that this is the end of Taika's character in the show?
I do wonder if he can be brought back. Like maybe that they keep IG-11's memory or something in a data bank, and he can be uploaded to any droid body and come back. I think that would be kind of cool, actually, if we keep getting different versions of IG-11, or even just different IG droids that happen to have Taika's voice. I think that could be something that's interesting if Mandalorian keeps encountering different versions of that. But yeah, it would be kind of weird if they used him and have all these action figures and stuff like that, and then just kill him off in the first episode completely.
Gentlemen, might I remind you about Darth Maul?
Yeah.
But that's like a primary.
But that was 2 hours of content. This is 40 minutes. By the way, we should also talk about that. I am shocked that this episode was like 40 minutes long. Usually, like nowadays, I feel like, your Game of Thrones is like 55 minutes to an hour. Like, do we think all the episodes are going to be this short?
I don't know. I think Disney Plus is going to let them tell the stories in the length of time that they have. And I feel like that's something they talked about at the press conference we were at, is that like they were able to fit the length to the story without having to cut for commercial breaks and stress out about things. And I think we're going to see that more and more generally, as streaming is the way we're going to see these shows at first, that they're going to do the story, they're going to cut it right, even though the scripts might be the same amount of pages, the minutes, the runtime is going to fluctuate.
I know we're going long. Bryan, do you have a few more minutes to talk with us?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to talk about the framing, because this episode begins with a new Star Wars brand opening. This looks kind of like how Marvel opens with the Marvel Studios like intro. This seems like a new thing. Probably won't see it on episode 9, I'm assuming, but we might see it on future Star Wars movies and shows. And this shows us helmets, shows us Vader, shows us BB-8, 3PO, Kylo, R2, an X-Wing helmet, Stormtrooper, new, old and new, and then the Mandalorian fat helmet. What do you guys think about this? Like, I love that Star Wars is finally getting kind of like a brand logo, kind of like the Marvel franchise has, but I'm not sure if helmets and like the colors of lightsabers reflecting off them is the way to go.
I mean, it's something that they needed to come up with some branding, and who knows how long this lasts. I wasn't necessarily put off by it, but I was more excited to watch The Mandalorian than I was to critique the opening logo.
Yeah. Brad, any thoughts on the opening?
Yeah, I mean, it's fine. I don't really know what else you would do to make it that much cooler.
Show moments like from throughout the franchise history, kind of like Marvel does in a way. I don't know, I guess
they probably didn't want to directly copy that either, you know. But like, yeah, I don't know. I feel like the Lucasfilm logo itself is enough, you know. And like, whenever anyone sees the Lucasfilm logo show up before something, they're like, "Oh, we're about to get something Star Wars or something that I don't care about."
Yeah. The other thing I want to talk about is the end credits, because the end credits have this like amazing bit of concept art from the episode. I hope they have new concept art for each end credit scene because it was so beautiful.
Yeah, no, I really loved that, and it really highlighted the Goranson score, which I mean, like, I was going to sit there and just sort of enjoy the score no matter what, but having that really cool concept art was rad. And speaking of the score really quickly, like, I really loved how it felt. Yeah, there were those moments of Rocky, but it felt like Goranson was told, give me what it would sound like if Ennio Morricone had been tasked with filling a galaxy far, far away, but with more electronic instruments than just his normal orchestra.
For sure. I love that score, and I've seen that's the other bit of criticism I see online. Some people are turned off by this score a little bit because I feel like it's so far away from John Williams and the traditional Star Wars score. What do you think, Brad?
No, I love the score, and I actually think that it lines right in with the spirit of the series, at least from this first episode, is that it's something that feels like Star Wars, but also is starting to branch out into its own thing. And there are themes here that are remnant of Star Wars and the orchestral arrangements that John Williams and Michael Giacchino have composed. But I like that he's introduced, you know, some tribal elements with regards to Mandalorian scenes, and also that little extra kind of tech electronic touch that makes it feel otherworldly. And it gives us a sense that, you know, we're not in the same, you know, sect of the Star Wars universe that we're used to playing in.
Yeah. And because... what were you going to say?
I was going to say, if people dig this, Kevin Kiner, who did the scores for Clone Wars and Rebels, did a lot of work that hinted at things like this, and I think Goranson has sort of taken that ball and run with it. But that was definitely something that George had insisted on, and Filoni talked about how when George was working on those, he said, we need to bring this otherworldly, these other cultures, and those sorts of musical influences into Star Wars. Filoni commented, I think it was at that press conference, that this is finally what he understood, really what George meant when they started putting in Goranson's score to Mandalorian.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And lastly, I think if we're going to get all nerdy on this, we should acknowledge that there is no opening crawl for... I know that they've abandoned those for the Star Wars story movies, but we're not getting that here. They have been on the comic books and the video games. So does that mean going forward we're just going to abandon the opening crawl?
I think it's going to be up to the filmmakers and the storytellers, right? I know with Gareth Edwards, he talked a lot about how they debated back and forth about what would be best for the movie for Rogue One. And I think it would really come down to if the filmmaker feels that it's right.
I feel like it would have been perfect for this, like a show that like you're watching week to week, and in future episodes you could easily be reminded of, like, you know, where the story left off. it feels like perfect for a show. I mean, I understand for the movies, I understand, giving the filmmakers the reign to, choose if it's right for that story. But I don't know, I miss the opening crawl. I feel like the opening crawl is part of Star Wars for me.
I think that in this case, it's probably just too redundant, because you're already watching week to week, and people are keeping up on what's happening, and there's probably not going to be much time passage between episodes, so there aren't exactly a lot of gaps to fill in. And I think to use a scroll as like a recap, like last week on The Mandalorian, just doesn't seem necessary. And plus, on top of that, the opening crawl itself takes like 2 to 3 minutes or something to do. So I just...
Well, it's only 40 minutes, Brad, so they could have added some time on here.
But yeah, I think that with a week-to-week show, I don't think that it's necessary to do it.
Okay, that brings us to the end of today's podcast. I want to thank both of you for joining us. Bryan, if people want to find more of your work, they can definitely read the Mandalorian piece that we have on the site today. I'll link that in the show notes, but where else can people find you?
Right now, I do a weekly roundup of Star Wars news for the Sci-Fi Channel, and then I'm doing I'm reviewing all the episodes for you all on Slash Film, and you can find me at the Full of Sith podcast. You can find me on Twitter at Swankmotron, which I will talk to you about Star Wars there, pretty much guaranteed.
Brad, where can people find your work?
Always on slashfilm.com. You can also find me on Twitter at Ethan_Anderton, and also listen to my podcast called Go Flix Yourself, FLIX, available on iTunes and other podcasting platforms.
And I'm curious what you guys think. I know we're doing a weekly Watchmen podcast. Would you like to hear a weekly Mandalorian podcast? Write me an email at peter@slashfilm.com or tweet me at slashfilm on Twitter and let me know what you think. Does this show deserve it? I know there's not it's not as confusing as Watchmen, and not as depth. There's not a depth of what the thing is trying to say as Watchmen, but maybe we can make a show out of it. Anyways, you can find more of my work on slashfilm.com, at slashfilm on Twitter. This podcast, Slashfilm Daily, is published every weekday on iTunes, Google, Overcast, Spotify, all the popular podcast apps. Please rate and review this podcast on iTunes. Tell your friends, spread the word, and we'll see you tomorrow.